The mountains don't care about your past. They don't care if you were a queen or a pauper. Up here, in the high reaches of the Tetons, the wind is the only judge, and it is a cold one. Most folks come to the West looking for gold, but some come looking for a place to disappear. One chilly autumn morning, a man who had already disappeared found something he never expected, a flash of blue silk against the gray stone of the creek. A woman, broken and discarded, like a piece of unwanted driftwood. This is her story.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. If you find peace in these stories of the Old West and the strength of the human spirit, please take a moment to subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a journey into the wild. Now, let's head into the high country.
The year was 1874. Up on the Great Divide, the season they call the Gray had arrived. It's that bitter time between the last golden leaf of autumn and the first heavy blanket of winter snow. Caleb felt it in his knees. He was a man built like the timber he worked with, gnarled, sturdy, and silent. He had lived on the ridge for 7 years, far from the noise of the growing towns and the ghosts of his own history. Caleb spent his mornings reading the mountain. He didn't use books, he used the clouds and the behavior of the elk. Today the wind was coming from the north, sharp as a whetted blade. He was out near Snow Creek, gathering fallen cedar. In the high country, you learn to spot anything that doesn't belong. Nature is a pattern of browns, greens, and grays. Anything else is a warning. That was when he saw it. Down in the rocky bed of the creek, half submerged in the icy water, was a shock of blue. At first, Caleb thought it might be a lost pack or a discarded blanket, but as he scrambled down the slick embankment, his heart hammered against his ribs. It was a woman. She lay face down among the smooth river stones. Her fine dress was tattered, the delicate fabric shredded by thorns and rock. She wasn't moving. Caleb knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands shaking just a little. He didn't see any sign of a horse or a wagon. There were no tracks. It was as if the mountain itself had simply dropped her there to be forgotten. He gently turned her over. Her face was pale, the color of wood ash, and her lips had a terrifying blue tint. She had been beaten by more than just the weather. There were dark bruises on her porcelain skin, marks that didn't come from a fall. Someone had tried to break her before the cold could finish the job. Caleb pressed 2 fingers to her neck. For a long, agonizing second, there was nothing. Then a faint, thready flutter. She was still fighting, but the sky was turning the color of lead, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to dance in the air. He was 3 miles from his cabin, and the path was steep. "Stay with me, miss," he whispered, his voice gravelly from weeks of disuse. He didn't have a sled, he didn't have a horse, he only had his strength. He wrapped his heavy wool coat around her small frame and lifted her into his arms. As he began the grueling climb back up the ridge, the wind began to howl. He knew the mountain was trying to claim her, and for the first time in years, Caleb had something to lose.
The climb was a slow, agonizing crawl against the clock. Every step Caleb took felt like pulling his boots out of wet clay. The woman in his arms weighed little more than a bundle of dry kindling, but the altitude made every breath a struggle. The wind whipped around the granite peaks, screaming like a banshee, threatening to knock them both into the ravine. Caleb didn't look back. He focused on the narrow, winding deer trail that led to his sanctuary. When he finally kicked open the heavy oak door of his cabin, the smell of seasoned wood and dried herbs greeted him. It was a humble space, but it was solid. He laid her down on a thick pallet of furs near the stone hearth. Her skin felt like ice, a dangerous sign of deep hypothermia. In the Old West, survival wasn't about luck. It was about knowing how to work with what the earth gave you. Caleb didn't waste a second. He knew he couldn't just throw her into a hot bath. The shock would stop her heart. Instead, he moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen many winters. He went to his wood stove and moved the heavy cast-iron kettle over the direct flame. While the water heated, Caleb fetched 2 large river stones he kept near the fire for just this purpose. He wrapped the warm stones in thick layers of flannel. This was an old mountain man's trick, placing the stones near the person's core to gently radiate heat back into the blood. It was a slow process, a patient battle against the creeping frost that had settled in her bones. He knelt beside her, his large hands looking out of place against her delicate features. He began to rub her hands and feet, working the circulation back toward her heart. "Don't you quit now," he murmured, his voice competing with the rattling of the window panes. As the kettle began to whistle, he prepared a brew of willow bark and dried rose hips. In the 1800s, willow bark was the frontiersman's aspirin, containing salicin to help with the pain and inflammation. The rose hips provided a concentrated dose of vitamin C, something every trapper knew was vital for keeping the body from surrendering to exhaustion. He managed to trickle a few drops of the warm liquid between her pale lips. She let out a small, ragged gasp. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. In the flickering orange light of the fire, Caleb saw the true extent to the shadows under her eyes. She wasn't just cold, she was weary in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He sat back on his heels, watching the firelight dance on the walls, wondering what kind of man could leave a soul out in the gray to wither away.
The night stretched on, measured only by the rhythmic popping of the pine logs in the hearth. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat in his ladder-back chair, his eyes moving between the door and the woman on the floor. In the wilderness, vigilance is the price of life. He watched her chest rise and fall, a little steadier now, as the warmth of the river stones did its silent work. As the first hint of gray dawn filtered through the parchment-covered windows, she stirred. It wasn't a gentle waking, it was a jolt of pure, instinctive terror. Her eyes snapped open, wide, frantic, and unfocused. She tried to scramble backward, but her limbs were still heavy and unresponsive from the cold. A strangled cry escaped her throat, a sound of someone expecting a blow. Caleb immediately stood up, but he saw her flinch and instantly froze. He knew the look in her eyes. It was the look of a trapped doe. He didn't move toward her. Instead, he took 2 long steps backward, putting the heavy oak table between them. He made himself small, leaning against the wall, keeping his hands visible and open. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and steady, like the hum of a distant honeybee. "You're in my cabin, on the ridge. There's no one here but us, and I don't mean you any harm." Sarah stared at him, her breathing coming in ragged hitches. She looked at the furs covering her, then at the steam rising from the tin cup on the hearth. Her gaze darted around the room, taking in the bundles of drying sage hanging from the rafters and the hand-carved shelves. She was looking for a way out, but she was also looking for a threat. Caleb reached out slowly and pushed the cup of willow bark tea toward the edge of the table. "You need to drink. It'll help the aching. Your body has been through a war with the frost." She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat felt like it was filled with dry sand, and the memories of the night before were a jagged blur of shouting and the biting wind. She looked at Caleb. His beard was silvered with age, and his face was lined like a topographic map. But his eyes were different than the ones she had fled. They weren't cold. They were tired, filled with a strange, quiet understanding.
Recognizing her need for privacy, Caleb picked up a heavy canvas sheet. With a few practiced movements, he strung it across a hemp rope he had rigged near the corner of the room. It created a small private sanctuary for her. "I'll be outside tilling the woodpile," he said, quietly. "The door latches from the inside if it makes you feel better. I won't come back in without knocking." He stepped out into the biting morning air, leaving her with the silence and the heat. For the first time in a long time, Sarah wasn't being hunted. But as she gripped the warm tin cup, she wondered if the scars she carried would ever truly let her be free. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy, broken only by the whistling wind outside and the steady tick of a small brass clock on the mantel. Sarah sat behind the canvas curtain, her fingers trembling as they curled around the warm tin cup. The willow bark tea was bitter, but as it slid down her throat, she felt a dulling of the sharp knives that seemed to be stabbing at her joints. She stared into the glowing embers of the hearth. In the dancing flames, the shadows of her past began to flicker. She didn't see faces, those she had forced herself to forget, but she felt the weight of them. She remembered the suffocating silk of her dresses in the city, the cold marble floors, and the feeling of being a bird in a gilded cage. She remembered the moment the cage had shattered, and the long, terrifying journey west that had ended in a betrayal she never saw coming. She had been discarded like refuse on that ridge, left to let the mountain finish what a cruel man had started. But the mountain hadn't taken her. Instead, it had delivered her to this strange, quiet giant. Through the small window, she watched Caleb. He wasn't just working, he was moving with a purposeful grace. He was splitting logs, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing through the crisp air. To a city dweller, wood was something you bought from a vendor. But here, as Caleb knew, wood was life. There's a science to a winter woodpile. You don't just stack it, you grate it. Caleb was separating the fast-burning pine, which he'd use for quick morning heat, from the dense, slow-burning oak and hickory that would hold a coal all through a freezing night. He was also checking the check marks on the logs, the natural cracks that form as wood dries, to ensure it was seasoned enough to prevent chimney fires. In the 1870s, a chimney fire meant losing your home, and losing your home meant losing your life. Eventually, the chopping stopped. Sarah heard a polite, heavy thud on the door, the knock Caleb had promised. She pulled the furs tighter around her shoulders, her voice finally finding its way through the fog. "Come in," she whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a porch. Caleb entered, carrying an armload of fresh cedar and a small burlap sack. He didn't look directly at her, respecting the space she had reclaimed. He moved to the small kitchen corner and pulled out a heavy mortar and pestle. "Storm's settled for a bit, but the belly don't care about the weather. I'm going to fix some journey cake and dried venison. It's a bit salty, but it'll put the red back in your cheeks." Sarah watched Caleb grind the dried corn into a coarse meal. For the first time, the fear in her chest felt less like a physical weight and more like a fading echo. She realized that in this cabin, everything had a use and everything was handled with care, including her. The smell of the journey cake, a simple mixture of cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, began to fill the cabin. In the Old West, this was the fuel of the frontier. It was dense, durable, and gave a traveler enough energy to walk 20 miles of rugged trail. Caleb cooked it on a greased cast-iron griddle, the sizzle providing a comforting rhythm to the quiet morning. Sarah watched his hands. They were scarred and stained by walnut husks and wood smoke, but they moved with a gentleness that confused her. She had spent a lifetime believing that strength was synonymous with cruelty. Yet here was a man who could fell a tree with a single swing, now carefully plating a humble meal for a woman who could offer him nothing in return.
"I can't stay in this bed forever," Sarah said, her voice gaining a bit of its former silkiness. She pushed back the heavy buffalo robe, her legs feeling like lead. "The body is a lot like a rusted gate," Caleb replied, not looking up from the stove. "If you let it sit too long, it seizes up, but if you force it too fast, the hinges snap. Take it slow, Miss Sarah." She took a deep breath and swung her feet to the floor. The chill of the wide-planked boards made her gasp, but she gritted her teeth. She tried to stand, but her balance was gone, her knees buckling under her own weight. Before she could hit the floor, Caleb was there. He didn't grab her. He simply offered his forearm, solid as a branch of mountain mahogany. She leaned on him, feeling the heat radiating from his wool shirt. Slowly, painfully, she made it to the small porch just outside the door. The air hit her like a bucket of ice water, but it was clean, so clean it stung her lungs. Caleb reached into the shadows of the porch and pulled out a sturdy branch of ash wood. He had spent the previous hour debarking it and smoothing the handle with a draw knife. He handed it to her. "A third leg for the mountain," he said. "Ash is flexible, but won't break under a heavy load. It'll give you back your independence." Sarah leaned on the makeshift crutch, looking out over the ridge. The valley below was a sea of dark pines, and the peaks above were jagged teeth of white marble. For the first time, she didn't just see a wasteland. She saw a fortress. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb looked out at the horizon, his eyes tracking the flight of a hawk circling in the updrafts. "Out here, we don't ask why a person is in the storm. We just open the door. The mountain is hard enough without us making it harder on each other." As Sarah stood there, supported by a piece of wood and the presence of a stranger, she realized she was no longer the porcelain doll that had been broken in the city. She was something new. She was a survivor, learning to stand on ground that didn't belong to anyone but the wind.
The following days were marked by a new kind of rhythm. On the frontier, there was no room for the idle melancholy Sarah had known in her former life. In the mountains, if you didn't move, you froze. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. Sarah's strength began to return, not in a sudden burst, but in the steady thickening of her spirit. She grew tired of being a spectator to Caleb's toil, and one morning she moved the canvas curtain aside with a look of firm resolve. "Teach me," she said, watching Caleb work at the table. He looked up, a hint of a smile ghosting behind his beard. He didn't offer her a heavy axe or a plow. Instead, he pulled a chair out and set a heap of tangled hemp rope and several wooden slats before her. "A mountain man's life is held together by cordage and knots," he explained. "Winter is coming, and my snowshoes need rewebbing. It's a job for patient fingers." As they sat together, the cabin filled with the earthy scent of the hemp. Caleb showed her the clove hitch and the bowline, knots that had been used for centuries by sailors and woodsmen alike. He explained that a good knot must be easy to tie in the dark, hold under a massive load, and yet remain easy to untie even when soaked and frozen. Educational value wasn't just in the knots, but in the conversation that flowed with the work. Sarah learned that Caleb hadn't always been a hermit. He spoke of a time years ago, back east, when a shadow called yellow fever had swept through his town. He had lost his wife and young daughter in a single week. The noise of the world, the sympathy, the prying eyes, the crowded streets had become a weight he couldn't carry. "I didn't come here to die," said Caleb, his voice low and steady. "I came here because the mountains don't ask you to be anything other than what you are. They don't pity you, and they don't judge you." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She told him, for the first time, about the man who had brought her west under the guise of marriage, only to reveal a heart of stone once they were far from the reach of the law. She described the moment he had decided she was an encumbrance and left her at the creek.
Working with her hands gave Sarah a strange sense of agency. As she pulled the hemp tight, she felt like she was mending the frayed edges of her own life. They weren't just fixing snowshoes, they were building a bridge of trust. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't awkward or fearful. It was the shared silence of two people who understood that survival was the highest form of redemption.
The peace of the cabin was shattered by a sudden, violent shift in the barometer. Even before the sky turned the color of bruised slate, the mountain gave its warnings. The squirrels had vanished into their hollows, and the birds had ceased their chatter. Caleb stood on the porch, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the air. It smelled of wet iron and ozone, the unmistakable signature of a norther. "The gray is over," Caleb said, his voice taut. "The white is coming, and it's coming fast." In the 1870s, an early mountain blizzard wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a siege. If you weren't prepared, the cold would find the smallest crack in your walls and turn your blood to slush. Caleb and Sarah moved with a frantic but coordinated urgency. There was no more time for stories. Caleb showed Sarah how to use chinking, a mixture of mud, straw, and horsehair, to plug the gaps between the logs where the summer heat had caused the wood to shrink. While he hauled the last of the heavy oak logs from the outdoor pile into the indoor wood box, he instructed Sarah on the root cellar inventory. The root cellar was a sanctuary of survival. Located beneath the floorboards, it used the earth's natural insulation to keep food at a constant temperature, preventing it from freezing or rotting. Caleb had stored potatoes, carrots, and salted meat in layers of dry sand to wick away moisture. "Count the jars," he barked, not out of anger, but out of necessity. "We need to know exactly how many calories we have if the drifts go over the roof." As they worked, the first gust hit. It wasn't a wind, it was a physical blow that made the entire cabin groan. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in minutes. Caleb dragged the heavy leather snow hides over the window shutters, bolting them from the inside. This wasn't just to keep out the cold, but to prevent the pressure of the wind from shattering the glass. Sarah felt a flicker of the old panic rising in her chest, but she looked at her hands. They were stained with hemp and earth, no longer the soft hands of a city lady. She realized she wasn't just a guest anymore. She was a part of this fortress. "The fire is the heart," Caleb told her, his eyes reflecting the growing orange glow of the hearth. "As long as it beats, we live, but the mountain is going to try and blow the candle out." By nightfall, the world outside had vanished into a screaming wall of white. The cabin was a tiny island in a frozen sea, and the real test of their survival and their bond was about to begin. The storm didn't just howl, it roared. It felt as though 1,000 spectral hands were clawing at the cedar shingles, trying to find a way into the warmth. Inside, the cabin was a pocket of flickering orange light. Caleb and Sarah sat close to the hearth, the heat of the fire their only shield against the sub-zero darkness. But nature has a way of finding the weakness in any armor. Around midnight, the wind shifted into a violent vortex. Suddenly, a heavy, muffled thump echoed from the roof, followed by a terrifying hiss. Smoke began to pour out of the fireplace, filling the room with a choking gray haze. "The chimney!" Caleb coughed, springing to his feet. "The snow has drifted over the flue, or a shelf of ice has collapsed into it." This was a lethal scenario. Without the fire, they would freeze. With the fire blocked, they would suffocate from carbon monoxide. In the 1870s, many frontier families were lost to this silent killer. Caleb grabbed a long iron rod, but the blockage was too high. He had to act, and he had to do it in the dark. "Sarah, listen to me," Caleb shouted over the roar of the wind. "I have to go out and clear the roof. You must keep the door clear from the inside. If the snow piles up against the frame while I'm out there, I'll be buried alive." He wrapped a safety line, the same hemp rope Sarah had mended, around his waist, and tethered the other end to the heavy bedpost. He vanished into the white wall of the storm. Sarah was left alone in the thickening smoke. Her lungs burned, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She grabbed a heavy shovel and stood by the door. Every few minutes, she had to heave her weight against it, clearing the frozen accumulation that threatened to seal them in. Her muscles screamed, and the cold bit through her clothes, but she didn't stop. She realized that for the first time in her life, someone was relying on her to save them. Outside, through the cracks, she heard the rhythmic scrape of Caleb's shovel against the stone chimney. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, with a great whoosh, the draft returned. The smoke was sucked upward, and the fire roared back to life. A moment later, Caleb tumbled back through the door, coated in a thick crust of ice and snow. He was shivering violently, his hands turning a waxy white. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dragged him toward the fire, stripping off his frozen coat and wrapping him in the buffalo robes. She rubbed his hands just as he had rubbed hers days before. In that freezing darkness, huddled together for warmth, the last of the barriers between them dissolved. Sarah spoke into the silence, her voice trembling. She told him about the night she was left behind, how she had prayed for the end. "I thought the world was only made of men who take," she whispered. Caleb reached out, his frozen fingers slowly regaining feeling. He took her hand. "The world is a hard place, Sarah, but as long as there's a fire burning somewhere, there's a way back."
The dawn didn't break. It bled into the world, a soft, pale lavender that turned the jagged peaks of the Tetons into glowing embers. The storm had spent its fury, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. The cabin was nearly buried, the snow drifting halfway up the windows, turning the interior into a dim, blue-tinted sanctuary. Inside, the air was finally clear. The fire was a steady, comforting pulse in the hearth. Caleb and Sarah sat on the floor, the buffalo robes shared between them. The immediate terror of the night had passed, replaced by a strange, fragile clarity. In the Old West, survivors knew that the end of a storm wasn't just a physical relief, it was a spiritual one. It was the thaw, a time when the adrenaline fades and the truth of one's situation remains. Caleb moved to the window, clearing a small patch of frost with the heel of his hand. "The crust is firm," he said, his voice reflecting the exhaustion of his battle with the roof. "In a day or two, once the sun sets the pack, a man on snowshoes could make it down to the valley floor. The trail to the settlement at Blackwood will be passable." Sarah felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. The settlement, the law, the world of people, gossip, and the man who had tried to erase her. "I have a sled in the lean-to," Caleb continued, his back still turned to her. He spoke with the flat, practical tone of a man who was used to doing the right thing, even when it hurt. "I can pull you down. The sheriff there is a decent man. He'll help you find your way back east. You can put all of this, the ridge, the cold, the hunger, behind you." Sarah looked at her hands. They were no longer soft. They were calloused from the hemp rope and the shovel. She thought about the civilization he was offering. In the 19th century, a woman in her position was often seen as damaged goods, a victim of her own frailty. Returning meant returning to a world of whispers and pity. "Is that what you want, Caleb? For me to go back to being a ghost in a silk dress?" Caleb finally turned. His eyes were weary, but they burned with a sudden fierce honesty. "What I want doesn't matter. I'm a man of the woods, Sarah. I've got nothing to offer but hard work and a roof that occasionally leaks smoke. You're a lady. You weren't meant for the frost." "I wasn't meant to die in a creek either, but I survived it, and I survived the long night. Maybe I wasn't meant for the frost, but maybe, just maybe, the frost was meant for me." The truth hung in the air, as sharp and clear as an icicle. The path was open, but for the first time in her life, Sarah realized that the person who held the map wasn't the man who had hurt her, or even the man who had saved her. It was her. 2 days later, the world was a cathedral of white and gold. The sun had returned, turning the frozen wilderness into a shimmering landscape that blinded the unprepared eye. Caleb had finished the sled. It was a masterpiece of frontier engineering, fashioned from flexible birch runners and bound with the very hemp cordage Sarah had helped mend. They stood at the rim, the high point of the ridge where the land fell away into the sprawling valley below. From here, they could see the faint, thin curls of smoke rising from the chimneys of Blackwood. It looked like another world, small, crowded, and busy. Caleb adjusted the harness on his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We can be there by nightfall," he said, though his voice lacked its usual steady strength. "You'll be warm, you'll be safe." Sarah looked at the town. Then she looked at Caleb. She saw the man who had carried her through a blizzard, the man who had taught her that labor was a form of prayer, and the man who had given her the space to breathe again. She looked down at the ash wood crutch in her hand, a symbol of her own resilience. "Safety isn't a place, Caleb," she said softly. She reached out and unhooked the lead rope from the sled, letting it drop into the pristine snow. "I spent my whole life being safe in a house someone else built, following rules I didn't make. I was never more in danger than when I was in a parlor in the city." She stepped closer to him, the crisp snow crunching under her boots. "The mountain took everything I didn't need and left me with what matters. It left me with a life I actually earned, and it gave me a friend who knows my name, not my social standing." Caleb's rugged face softened, the tension in his jaw finally breaking. He didn't say a word, but he reached out and took her hand. It wasn't the grasp of a rescuer anymore. It was the hand of a partner. They didn't head down the mountain toward the smoke of the settlement. Instead, they turned back toward the cabin. As they walked, Caleb pointed out a set of tracks in the snow, a mother lynx and her kit. He explained how they survived the deep freeze by growing thick fur pads on their paws, a natural snowshoe that kept them above the drifts. When they reached the cabin, the hearth was still warm. Sarah hung her coat on the peg and moved to the stove to start the evening meal. Caleb brought in a fresh load of cedar, the scent filling the room. There were no vows exchanged, no grand declarations of love, just the quiet, powerful understanding of two souls who had found their harbor in the middle of a storm. The ridge was no longer a place of silence and shadows. It was home, and as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long violet shadows across the snow, the mountain finally seemed at peace.
There is a special kind of strength that only grows in the cold, and Sarah and Caleb found it together on that high ridge. Their story reminds us that sometimes being lost is the only way to truly be found. If this journey touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who might need a reminder that redemption is always possible. We'd love to have you as part of our community, so don't forget to subscribe and join us for more tales of the Old West. But I want to hear from you. What part of Sarah's journey resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. If you're looking for more stories of love and survival, check out our Mountain Legends playlist on the screen now. Until next time, keep your fire burning bright and stay safe out there on the trail. Be well, friends.